It would later be described by investigators as one of the most unnecessary encounters ever recorded inside a major American airport, an interaction driven not by intelligence, evidence, or lawful authority, but by assumption, and it would ultimately trigger a federal lawsuit so devastating it would cost a single officer $40 million. But on the morning it happened, no one inside Terminal 4 realized they were witnessing the beginning of a national scandal. The date was September 3rd, 2024, and the terminal was already alive with the familiar choreography of modern travel. Rolling suitcases humming across tile floors, boarding announcements echoing overhead, business travelers checking phones, families clustering around gates. Everything about the morning felt ordinary. Agent Ryan Caldwell stood near the priority boarding lane, wearing a crisp uniform and the quiet confidence of someone who believed his badge gave him wide discretion. At 28 years old, Caldwell was still early in his career, recently reassigned from field enforcement to airport operations, a move he considered beneath his ambitions. His training record showed competence, but also repeated notes about impulsive decision-making and a tendency to act first and justify later. He had been told airport assignments required restraint and precision. He had nodded during those briefings. But restraint was not what guided his eyes when he noticed a black woman approaching the priority line just after 10 o'clock. She moved with calm assurance, dressed in a tailored gray suit, leather briefcase tucked neatly under her arm, boarding pass already pulled up on her phone. Her name was Simone Carter, though Caldwell did not know that yet. What he saw, or thought he saw, was something that did not align with his internal expectations of who belonged in that space. There was no alert, no tip, no behavioral indicators that would rise to reasonable suspicion. She wasn't nervous, wasn't rushing, wasn't scanning her surroundings. She simply stepped into the priority lane like countless travelers before her. But something in Caldwell's posture shifted. Later footage would capture the exact moment. His shoulders squared, his gaze narrowed, his body turning fully toward her. In his mind, a narrative began forming. Quietly, instinctively, dangerously. He left his assigned position and walked directly into her path, stopping close enough to force her to halt. "Ma'am," he said, his tone formal but edged with authority. "I need to see your identification and proof of citizenship." The question was framed as routine, but the expectation was obedience. Simone Carter looked up slowly, not startled, not afraid, just surprised by the abrupt intrusion. She had spent years navigating courtrooms in government buildings. She recognized the difference between lawful inquiry and overreach. "On what basis?" she asked calmly. That single question disrupted the script Caldwell expected. His jaw tightened. "This is a random immigration check," he replied. The words sounded official, but they had no legal foundation. Carter knew it immediately. Random immigration checks inside domestic airport terminals were not lawful without reasonable suspicion. She had litigated cases built on that exact principle. "I'm not required to provide that without cause," she said evenly. Passengers nearby slowed, sensing tension. Caldwell felt eyes turning toward them. He felt control slipping. "If you refuse," he warned, "you can be detained." Carter did not raise her voice. She did not insult him. She did not move. "Detained for what?" she asked. That question should have ended the encounter. Instead, it escalated it. Caldwell stepped closer, invading her personal space, his hand gesturing toward her arm. "Step aside," he ordered. "I haven't done anything wrong," Carter replied, her voice steady but firm. The exchange drew attention now. Phones appeared in hands. Someone began recording. Caldwell reached out and grabbed her arm above the elbow, not violently, but assertively, as if asserting dominance would manufacture authority where none existed. "Do not touch me," Carter said clearly. "You are violating my rights." That sentence would later echo through court filings, media commentary, and deposition transcripts. In that moment, however, it landed as a challenge. Caldwell tightened his grip and announced she was being detained for failure to comply. Handcuffs came out. In full view of the terminal, Simone Carter was cuffed, her briefcase set aside. Her calm expression replaced not with panic, but with something colder, recognition. She knew exactly what this was. She knew exactly where it would lead. As Caldwell escorted her toward a secondary room, travelers whispered. Cameras followed. A gate agent froze mid-announcement. What Caldwell believed was a routine assertion of authority was, in reality, the unlawful detention of a constitutional lawyer who had spent her career suing officers for exactly this kind of conduct. By the time the door to the screening room closed behind them, the damage was already irreversible. The footage was already out there. The witnesses were already forming opinions. And Caldwell, still convinced he was just doing his job, had no idea that this single decision, made in seconds, based on nothing but bias, had just set in motion a legal reckoning that would destroy his career, reshape policy, and cost his agency $40 million. By the time the door closed behind them in the small secondary screening room, the power dynamic agent Ryan Caldwell believed he controlled had already begun to unravel, though he didn't yet realize it. The room was stark and utilitarian: gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, a pair of plastic chairs, and it amplified every sound, including the faint buzz of phones vibrating outside as videos continued to upload. Simone Carter stood with her hands cuffed in front of her, posture straight, breathing slow and deliberate, forcing calm not because she was intimidated, but because she understood the value of composure when authority figures overstep. Caldwell remained standing, shifting his weight, rehearsing explanations in his head that sounded thinner the more he repeated them. He asked again for identification, this time more forcefully, framing the demand as procedure rather than choice. Carter met his eyes. "I'm going to say this once," she said evenly. "You are detaining me without reasonable suspicion, without probable cause, and without legal authority. Every second this continues increases your liability." Caldwell scoffed, the reflexive dismissal of someone unaccustomed to being warned by the people he restrained. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he replied, though the words lacked the confidence he intended. Carter didn't argue. Instead, she slowly leaned forward, careful and deliberate, and asked if she could retrieve something from her briefcase. Caldwell hesitated, then nodded, instructing her to move slowly. She did. From the briefcase, she removed a slim black credential holder and placed it on the table. "Before you decide what happens next," she said calmly, "you should look at that." Caldwell flipped it open. His eyes scanned the contents once, then again. A federal court bar admission, multiple jurisdictions, a national civil rights litigation credential. His breathing changed. Carter continued speaking, her voice steady, professional, almost instructional. "My name is Simone Carter. I am a senior civil rights attorney. I litigate constitutional violations committed by law enforcement officers, including unlawful detentions, racial profiling, and excessive force." She paused just long enough for the words to register. "I've argued these cases in federal court. I've deposed officers who made the same assumptions you just made." The room felt smaller. Caldwell's internal narrative fractured. The version where this was a simple misunderstanding no longer fit the facts in his hands. He straightened defensively. "That doesn't mean you're exempt from checks," he said, though the conviction in his voice was fading. "I'm not exempt from the law," Carter replied. "Neither are you," she explained, precisely and without emotion. The legal boundaries he had crossed, the absence of articulable suspicion, the illegality of a suspicionless immigration inquiry in a domestic terminal, the unlawful use of physical force, the public humiliation, the handcuffs. She didn't threaten. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated facts. Outside the room, supervisors were arriving, alerted by gate staff and security personnel who had already begun reviewing the footage. Caldwell's radio crackled, unanswered. He glanced at it, then back at Carter, who sat calmly despite the cuffs. Watching the moment he realized he was no longer the authority in the room. A supervisor entered, eyes moving quickly between Carter's restrained hands and Caldwell's rigid posture. "What's going on?" the supervisor asked. Carter spoke before Caldwell could. She identified herself, summarized the encounter in clear, chronological detail, and requested that all body camera footage and terminal video be preserved immediately. There was no exaggeration in her account, no emotion layered over the facts. The supervisor listened, his expression tightening with each sentence. He asked Caldwell to remove the handcuffs. Caldwell hesitated for half a second too long, then complied. The sound of the cuffs unlocking was quiet but final. Carter rubbed her wrists once, then folded her hands on the table. "I will be filing a formal complaint," she said, not as a threat, but as a statement of intent. And I will be requesting an independent investigation. The supervisor nodded. Caldwell was instructed to step outside. When the door closed behind him this time, the shift was unmistakable. He stood alone in the hallway, watching as airport officials and legal counsel moved with urgency. He could feel, but no longer control. Inside the room, Carter was offered water. She declined, already documenting everything on her phone while details were fresh: exact phrasing, timestamps, witnesses, camera placements. She knew how these cases unraveled. She knew how institutions closed ranks. And she knew that video changed everything. Within hours, clips of the encounter were everywhere. Caldwell grabbing her arm, Carter calmly asserting her rights, the handcuffs clicking shut. Public reaction was immediate and polarized, but the legal implications were not. By the time Carter left the airport, escorted now with apologies instead of commands, the internal review had already begun. Caldwell, meanwhile, sat in an administrative office, staring at a blank wall, replaying the moment he could have walked away. He would later insist he never intended harm, that he was following instinct, that it was a misunderstanding. But intent would not save him. The law did not care about instinct. It cared about actions. And the actions taken inside that terminal were already echoing far beyond it, moving steadily toward a courtroom where explanations would be measured not by confidence, but by consequences. What followed in the weeks after the detention was not a media cycle that flared and faded, but a slow, methodical collapse that unfolded exactly the way Simone Carter had warned it would. Within 48 hours, the internal review expanded into a joint federal inquiry as attorneys, supervisors, and risk management officials began reviewing footage frame by frame, transcript by transcript, unable to escape what the cameras showed with brutal clarity. There was no alert, no tip, no lawful justification recorded before the initial stop. There was no escalation from Carter, no resistance, no threat. There was only an officer acting on assumption and escalating when his authority was questioned. Caldwell was placed on administrative leave almost immediately, though the language of the notice was carefully neutral, full of procedural phrasing designed to buy time. But time did not help. Each new video angle released online stripped away another layer of plausible deniability. Legal analysts dissected the encounter publicly, explaining why the detention was unlawful from the first sentence Caldwell spoke. Civil rights organizations demanded accountability. Members of Congress requested briefings. The agency's legal department quickly realized this was not a case they could quietly settle or defend through technicalities. Carter filed her lawsuit less than 2 weeks later, and it was devastating in its precision. It laid out the encounter minute by minute, cited decades of established case law, and named not only Caldwell, but supervisors and policy failures that enabled him. When Caldwell was deposed, the damage became irreversible. Under oath, he struggled to articulate any specific facts that justified his actions. He admitted Carter had not behaved suspiciously. He admitted he had no evidence she was unlawfully present. When asked why he stopped her, he paused too long before answering, then said she didn't seem like she belonged in the priority line. The silence that followed that statement was louder than any accusation. From that moment on, the case stopped being about one bad decision and became a symbol of systemic profiling. The court denied qualified immunity early, ruling that the constitutional violations were obvious and clearly established. Settlement negotiations began quietly, then grew urgent as damages calculations climbed. Carter's attorneys argued not just emotional distress and reputational harm, but the chilling effect of unlawful detention by federal officers, the public humiliation, and the abuse of power in a secured transportation hub. When the final number was agreed upon, $40 million, it stunned even seasoned litigators. Caldwell was terminated before the settlement was announced, his law enforcement career ending not with ceremony, but with a single letter and the surrender of his credentials. He would later tell friends he never imagined it could go this far, that he thought he was just doing his job. But the law had already answered that claim. Carter returned to her work quietly after the case concluded, declining interviews, declining victory laps, letting the ruling speak for itself. The footage would continue to be used in trainings, classrooms, and courtrooms as an example of how quickly authority becomes liability when it is untethered from the Constitution. And long after the headlines faded, one truth remained. The encounter had never been about security. It had been about assumption. An assumption, when backed by power, carries a price.